George Parrott, known unflatteringly as Big Nose George. His story is etched in the annals of the Wild West. His prominent nose rivaled the grandeur of the Wyoming mountains he roamed. But it wasn't just his nose that made him memorable. It was his life of crime, his violent end, and the bizarre fate of his remains. His legend began in the untamed territories of the late 19th century, a man seeking fortune or perhaps just escape on the frontier. George Parrott chose the path of a highwayman, a rustler, a figure of fear. His crimes were marked by crude brutality. His story transcended the typical outlaw narrative, spiraling into the macabre. Justice in the West was often swift, sometimes delivered by a mob. George's end was not merely a hanging, it was the beginning of a more unsettling chapter. This is the story of Big Nose George Parrott. George Parrott's early life remains shrouded in mystery. By the 1870s, he had drifted into the American West, a haven for outlaws. He stumbled into a life of crime driven by desperation or disdain for honest labor. His criminal career began with petty offenses like stealing horses and cattle rustling. George and his gang roamed the territories, preying on ranchers and travelers. They were not masterminds, but their presence instilled fear. The transition from petty thief to hardened outlaw involved a point of no return. George became bolder, eyeing bigger targets. Their operations were clumsy, relying on intimidation and brute force. Each crime tightened the net around them. His early life of crime set the stage for a dramatic and gruesome final act. The year was 1878. Big Nose George and his gang aimed higher, targeting a Union Pacific train. Trains carried passengers, payrolls, and valuable goods. A successful train robbery could yield a fortune. The gang chose a remote spot near Hanna, Wyoming. Their plan: derail the train and plunder its riches. They toiled under the cover of darkness, loosening a rail, but a vigilant section foreman, Riker, noticed the tampered rail. He flagged down the approaching train, averting a derailment. The outlaws watched their grand scheme unravel. Frustration and anger surged through them. The gang fled. Their dreams of riches evaporated. They had drawn the serious attention of the Union Pacific Railroad and the law. This was no longer just cattle rustling. This was an attack on national infrastructure. The botched robbery marked them as dangerous men. It set in motion the chain of events leading to George's demise. The West was unforgiving, and their notoriety grew. The law was closing in. The failed train robbery left Big Nose George and his gang desperate. Their crimes escalated from robbery to cold-blooded murder. A posse including Deputy Sheriff Robert Whitfield and Union Pacific Detective Tip Vincent hunted them down. The outlaws set up an ambush near Rattlesnake Canyon. When Whitfield and Vincent rode into their sights, the gang opened fire. The lawmen were cut down in a hail of bullets. The murders transformed George and his associates into notorious killers. The hunt for Big Nose George intensified. The murders ignited outrage across Wyoming territory. The Union Pacific Railroad put up a substantial reward. for the capture of the killers. The manhunt was one of the largest the region had ever seen. Pauses scoured the countryside, tracking the gang. The names of Big Nose George and his gang became notorious. The pressure was immense. George became a boogeyman figure, his name whispered in saloons. His growing notoriety made it harder for him to hide. Despite the intensity of the manhunt, George evaded capture for nearly 2 years. They likely split up, seeking anonymity. But the reward money was a powerful motivator. The long arm of the law had a tenacious reach. George's days of freedom were numbered. George Parrott's downfall was precipitated by his own carelessness. In 1880, he was in Miles City, Montana, and boasted about his crimes. Someone overheard and alerted the authorities. George was apprehended and extradited to Rawlins, Wyoming. The journey back was fraught with tension. Upon arrival, the townspeople were incensed. The memory of the slain lawman was still fresh. The jail in Rawlins housed its most infamous prisoner. The legal process would run its course, but public outrage was palpable. George Parrott was now a caged animal, surrounded by those who despised him. His fate seemed sealed. George Parrott's trial for the murder of Deputy Widowfield was swift. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. With a death sentence looming, George plotted an escape. He acquired a pocket knife and worked on his shackles. On March 27, 1881, he made his move. He attacked jailer Robert Rankin, but was foiled by Rankin's wife, Rosa. The news of the attempted escape spread quickly. The community's patience with due process ran out. George had forfeited any right to a legal execution. The stage was set for the final grim act of his life. The mob was ready to take matters into their own hands. Frontier justice was about to be served. George's fate was sealed. The failed escape ignited public fury in Rawlins. A mob quickly formed, fueled by anger and a thirst for vengeance. On March 22, 1881, the mob marched on the jail. They overpowered the guards and dragged George from his cell. The mob led George to a telegraph pole. Their first attempt to lynch him was clumsy. Frustrated, they procured a ladder and a stronger rope. They forced George to ascend the ladder and kicked it away. George Parrott swung in the cold night air. The mob watched, their grim task completed. Justice in their eyes had been served. The official execution date would never arrive for George. The death of Big Nose George Parrott was not the end of his story. His body fell into the hands of two local physicians, Dr. Thomas Magee and Dr. John Eugene Osborne. Osborne had a peculiar interest in studying the criminal mind. The doctors conducted an autopsy and made a death mask of George's face. Dr. Osborne had parts of George's skin tanned and crafted into a pair of shoes. Osborne reportedly wore the shoes to his inaugural ball as governor. The top part of George's skull was sawn off and given to Lillian Heath, who used it as an ashtray and pen holder. The rest of George's remains were stored in a whiskey barrel. In 1950, construction workers unearthed the barrel containing human bones. Dr. Lillian Heath, then in her 80s, came forward with the skull cap. It fit perfectly. The shoes, too, eventually found their way into the public eye. Today, the shoes, death mask, and partial skull are on display at the Carbon County Museum. A permanent grisly testament to one of the Wild West's strangest tales. Big Nose George Parrot's story remains a grim reminder of the darker side of frontier justice.